One comic, 40 years. Join us, Earthlets, as we begin on the next 4 decades of 2000 AD. Borak Thung, Earthlets, and welcome to the 2000 AD Thrillcast. I'm your host, Marchant, and what a momentous occasion. 40 years of the galaxy's greatest comic. If you've not picked it up yet, please do make sure that you go out and get the 40th anniversary edition, either the Carl Square cover or the David Ayer cover, which has some fantastic one-shot stories in there by people like John Wagner, Pat Mills, Dan Abnett. We've also got Lauren Bucas and Dale Halverson, who were previous guests of the 2000 AD Thrillcast. It's a fantastic package. There's also in there a little primer for those people who haven't read 2000 AD in a while and are looking for some background information. It's got interviews, it's got reading lists, it's got further reading. Absolutely fantastic little package. That's available from all good newsagents, comic book stores, and also digitally from our web shop and apps. I want to take this opportunity to thank every single Earthlet who came along to the 2000 AD 40 Years of Thrill Power Festival in Hammersmith the week before last. It was an incredible day. To be honest with you, so much was happening, and running a convention is something you only want to do occasionally, that we didn't really have pause for breath, but all the feedback has been universally fantastic. So thank you for helping make it such a special day. Everyone seemed to have a great time. The creators seemed to have a great time. People who were there seemed to have a great time. We will be putting out the panels, all 12 of them, as podcast episodes over the next however many weeks, in between normal episodes of the 2000 AD Thrillcast. So stand by for weekly content from the Thrillcast. You can also watch them if you're feeling desperate to get hold of those panels on the 2000 AD YouTube channel, youtube.com/2000 AD online. But yeah, it was a great day. We're all very tired, just getting back to normal. Congratulations to Owen, who, as you heard on previous episode, was the guy behind the show. He really put his back into it, and we think it paid off. But the celebrations don't end there. Don't forget that this weekend we have 3 signings to celebrate 2000 AD's 40th anniversary. The first is at the Waterstones Edinburgh West End store, which is on Friday lunchtime, 12:30. We've got David Bishop and Carl Stock, the 2 people behind Thrill Power Overload, the expanded, revised, updated edition. They're going to be launching that there. And then on Saturday at Travelling Man in Manchester, we have Leah Moore, John Reppion and Steve Yao. And at Nostalgia and Comics in Birmingham, we have the terrific twosome of Disraeli and Ian Edgington. So do make sure you go along and say hello, get a sketch, get something signed, and help celebrate 40 years of the galaxy's greatest comic. Make sure you keep up with us online, because we're going to be doing loads of giveaways and, yes, talking so much about 2000 AD because it's amazing. But let's move on to other things, because one of the things that you can do to help celebrate 2000 AD's birthday is, if you are in the Big Smoke, if you're in London, then go along to the Cartoon Museum, where there is 2000 AD Future Shock, celebrating 40 years of 2000 AD artwork. It's an exhibition of original art, and there are some absolute corking pages, whether it's from Dredd, Dan Dare, Halo Jones, Slain, Strontium Dog. It's incredible just to get up close and personal with these pages. Not too personal. And we're going to be talking to Steve Marchant, who is the guy from the Cartoon Museum, who has put together really one of the best exhibitions of original art, 2000 AD original art that I've ever seen. It was a pleasure to go to the launch recently, so we're going to be talking to him a little bit about how he put it together and what 2000 AD means to him and the wider cultural movement in Britain and beyond. We're also going to be talking to one of my favourite artists, a veteran of 2000 AD, but also of British comics, John Burns, who back in the day worked on strips like UFO, The Seekers, George and Lynn from The Sun, all the way through to Judge Dredd, Nikolai Dante, and The Order, which is getting its first collection next month. I'm not going to try and pronounce the German title of the of the collection because I'll just muck it up. But that will be available from all good booksellers and from our web shop and apps. For those of you who have not read The Order, it is mental. It is a crazy mashup of Teutonic Knights, Elizabethan car chases, giant worms, and robots running around. It is Keck W and John Burns in very fine 2000 AD form. So certainly do make sure you pick up a copy. And we're going to be talking to John about his career, about getting his start as a young apprentice in the East End of London, and what working at 2000 AD still means to him all these years later. But first, like I said, we're going to be talking to Steve Marchant, the guy behind the fantastic exhibition at the Cartoon Museum. And it's a pleasure to welcome him to the Thrillcast. Welcome, Steve.
Well, thanks for having me, Mike.
No worries, no worries. Now, busy times at the Cartoon Museum. I understand you had quite a stampede after the 40th anniversary bash the other weekend.
Well, we certainly did. We had over 200 visitors the very next day, which is more than twice what we normally get on a Sunday. And a lot of people were saying they'd picked up a flyer at your bash. And, everybody was having such a good weekend. What a joy.
Good. Excellent. Glad to hear it. So tell us a little bit about, first off, the Cartoon Museum, because a lot of people, I don't think necessarily know that it's there and so central, because you're on Little Russell Street, aren't you, around the corner from Tottenham Court Road?
Yes, we are. Little Russell Street is a small street off Museum Street, right by the British Museum, between a pub and Pizza Express.
Excellent. And I mean, what's your mission at the Cartoon Museum?
My personal mission has been to try and transform the place into somewhere that's concentrated mainly on single-image cartoons and a lot of stuff from over 100 years ago, including comic art with that, including comic art from a long, long time ago, but also bringing things more up to date.
And the Future Shock exhibition that you've put together, tell us a little bit about what your ethos with this, because it's an original art exhibition, but you've got 40 years worth of original art. What's been your mission with the exhibition?
Well, the mission was mainly to try and show examples from all 4 decades of 2000 AD. And going into it, quickly became aware that, we're talking like tens of thousands of pages. Many, many, many artists. So just wanted to get a reasonable selection of the main characters and some of the most significant artists that have worked for it. Now, locating some of this artwork was quite difficult at times, and I'm very aware of 1 or 2 glaring omissions, but that was just purely down to what we would manage to borrow in the time that we had.
So much of this artwork over the years, because it wasn't necessarily valued by the companies that were publishing it, has vanished to the 4 winds. It's fortunate that private collectors have taken their enthusiasm for 2000 AD and kind of pick these pages up and preserve them, and is then able to lend them out.
Well, yes, exactly. And it's part of the Comic Creators Project, which is what they call the part precisely that, is to actually locate and preserve and exhibit British comic art. And yes, a lot of it's disappeared into the hands of private collectors, but a lot of them are more than keen to have it on display for an international range of visitors, rather than sitting in plant chests and drawers underneath their bed.
Take us through some of the pieces that you've got, because I noticed there was a significant number of very nice Dan Dare spreads that you had.
Well, with the Dan Dare stuff, as with a lot of the artwork in the early issues of 2000 AD, by Bellardinelli and Dave Gibbons and Brian Bolland and all those people at that time, wasn't printed to the best advantage. And the advantage you get from seeing the original art on display is how crisp and clear the line work was. And that's something you can really only appreciate by coming along and gasping in awe at the detail and the sheer size and scale of the original art.
Well, it's one of the things that I think people don't necessarily appreciate is with the strange dimensions that 2000 AD was back in its origin, which looks very odd now when you have the original issues, is just how big this artwork actually was in order to be reduced down and printed on not great paper.
Sure, and a lot of artists do still like to work, 2 or 3 times as big as it will actually be printed. But the other thing with the art at that time is the dimensions as well, in that, obviously in the early days, 2000 AD was almost square.
Yeah.
And so it is kind of, it's an odd, believe me, it's an odd size to keep finding frames for.
You've got a nice range of time. I mean, encompassing 40 years into, a few dozen pieces of art is a very tough job. So how have you sort of balanced the desire of seeing all this great, classic stuff from the late 70s and early 80s, and actually saying, well, 2000 AD is still a thing that's going, the last sort of 20 odd years of produced as many great pages as it had previously.
Well, it certainly has, and I mean that was one of my key thoughts when we first came up with the idea of having the exhibition. Is we didn't want it to just be looking back at the early days. We wanted to make sure there was representative pieces from right up until very recent times. So you will see Slain by Simon Davis. You will see work by Greg Staples. You will see some of David Roche's stunning pages from Prog 2000. And hopefully, going right back down through the decades. It's been a labour of love.
Good. Well, excellent, because it's certainly fascinating to look around. Was there anything specific that you are sad you could not include? I was on the hunt for Simon Bisley. Well, not personally, but I understand certain law authorities are. But no, for instance, asking around the many collectors, nobody seemed to know where a lot of his artwork had gone. So, but then again, we do have a piece of Bisley on display upstairs from a different project. And this, just because we're doing this for 2000 AD's 40th anniversary, does not preclude us doing further exhibits. In fact, I'm determined that we include more 2000 AD artwork in the upstairs comic art gallery, which is on display at all times. This runs until the 23rd of April?
Yes, it does. Plenty of time.
What has been the most surprising feedback you've had so far? Because I imagine many people are very happy to have seen it. Great to see these pages. What's the most surprising piece of feedback you've had?
From what I've seen, I often go for a wander out into the galleries from the office or from the classroom and seeing the international visitors. People who from their language or from their appearance are clearly not from around these parts. And that they are all taking it in and enjoying it and seeing the information. I mean, perhaps for a lot of them, 2000 AD has never been available in like Japan or Korea or wherever. And, it's been great just seeing it appeal to so many different types of people, from little kids that haven't read it and one hopes they'll be pestering dad to buy it them on the way home, right up to, those of us that were around when it first began.
2000 AD, certainly as far as we're concerned, it has been a massive cultural event over the last 4 decades. And Martin Rowson, who I believe is one of your trustees, at the opening of the exhibition, referred to 2000 AD as being threaded through British culture, akin to something like punk. It's had such a massive influence. How do you kind of show that? How can one appreciate just how far 2000 AD's reach has actually penetrated into British culture?
Well, I mean, coming back to the punk thing, that's one of the reasons we begin the exhibition with Simon Davis's wonderful kind of punk rock style Dredd painted cover. And I think what 2000 AD did was it injected the same level of energy and enthusiasm into British comics that punk rock did with British music at that time. And just as one could argue that punk then initiated, dance music and all the other sort of like fringe music types that have then drifted into the mainstream, it was the same with 2000 AD as a comic. I think, from 2000 AD we can clearly trace Deadline and Toxic back in the day, the old Toxic. And we can also obviously trace the way that the 2000 AD creators of years gone by have then invaded American comics and shaken those up too. And I don't think the face of comics would be the same or would be as exciting as it is today without the advent of 2000 AD and its continuing success.
It was something I was a comment that I saw on online was somebody said it's a shame 2000 AD isn't for kids anymore because there isn't the same kind of comic as 2000 AD was for kids now. But I think one of the things that really stuck out for me with the exhibition was just how much 2000 AD has grown with its fans. So whether you came to it in the 70s, or the 80s, or the 90s, it's grown up with you. And do you think that's part of why it's survived and others haven't?
Well, I do think that's the reason, because it's managed to not only retain its original core readership, because it's always been there. People like myself who, read it intermittently in the early days and dip into it, every so often. It's there. It's there for people, in a way that, the other older comics just concentrated purely on entertaining 8 to 12-year-olds. Which is not to say that 8 to 12-year-olds could not pick up 2000 AD and get a great deal out of it. The 8 to 12-year-olds of today are a lot more sophisticated than we were perhaps back in the 70s.
Going around the exhibition the other week, one thing that really struck me was, and it comes back to a comment that you made earlier, just how crisp and well-defined these pages are. So you've got a couple of pages of Brian Bolland, from the Dark Judges storyline, and you get up close to this stuff, and yes, it's behind glass, but you can see how every line that's there is clear, crisp, meant to be there. These pages didn't need a bodger to come in and smarten them up, because the quality of artwork that was being delivered was at the beginning of the process was so great.
Well, certainly, and I think the subject matter and the level of integrity applied to the tales in 2000 AD caused artists to kind of step up. I mean, I've read several times in different sources that the artists were almost competing with each other when they'd all sort of turn up at the office on a Friday afternoon, showing each other their latest pages. Everyone was trying to outdo each other. And I mean, I doubt that happened with Whizzer and Chips.
I don't know, you get something like Ken Reed's artwork on things like Faceache, and that's pretty special. Well,
yeah, I mean, obviously, there's the greats and the humour side of things, but Ken Reed being one, Leo Baxendale obviously being another.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, I mean, they I think they were geniuses, and they were there. They inspired everybody, but very few, I think, ended up rising to that level of insanity.
Mm-hmm. And with something like the Cartoon Museum, I mean, you've already mentioned how you're trying to change attitudes towards comic book art, when so many people in the mainstream kind of think of political cartooning and one panel illustrations and things like that as being worthy comic art, whereas comics are throwaway and disposable. Do you think that attitude is changing, or is it too entrenched?
Oh, I do think the attitude is changing. I think those of us that have grown up since '77 since '77 and the revolution that 2000 AD began, and also the rise in Fantagraphics type comics from the USA, and with the more easily available European comics, and comics now obviously online. I think that the general public's perception of comics is not as a trashy throwaway medium in the way that it used to be. I mean, go to any decent local library if you're lucky enough to still have one, and you'll see, in the teens and the adult sections, rows and rows of graphic novels available, and obviously including some great 2000 AD collections.
What's your favourite piece in the exhibition?
That's like saying, what's your favourite child? I think on a purely subjective, when you look at it, you go, sort of level, I think it's got to be the 3 David Roche pages. I mean, the older stuff has a lot of charm, and I love it intensely, but when I actually saw the size and the richness of that fella's work. Boy, oh boy, it's been a pleasure to meet him and a great pleasure to have his work on display to the public. If you think it looks good on the printed page, wait till you actually see it in the flesh, so to speak.
So do make sure that you head along to the Cartoon Museum. The exhibition is on until April the 23rd, and it's well worth a visit. If you're in that neck of the woods, fantastic, but make a special visit because it's an absolute joy to see these pages in their original format and to see somewhere like the Cartoon Museum, which is such an important part of Britain's cultural heritage, still going and still going strong and celebrating 40 years of 2000 AD. Now, as I said, one of my favourite artists on 2000 AD is John Burns, not just on things like Judge Dredd and Nikolai Dante, but The Order, which is a thrill in the true 2000 AD sense, a terrific mashup of action, history, and just general craziness. So it was great to be able to chat to John about his life and work and, The Order, Judge Dredd, Nikolai Dante and beyond. Now, John's first Dredd was one of the earliest strips in 2000 AD I ever read, starting in the early 90s, and it's an absolute wonder to welcome him onto the Thrillcast. Welcome, John.
Hi there.
So, I mean, you've been working for 2000 AD since the early 90s, but your career goes way back further than that. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you came to be an artist? Because you enjoyed drawing as a child, didn't you?
Yeah, well, when I was a young boy, so about 11 or 12, my brother, who could draw, sort of took me under his wing, and I picked up a lot of stuff from him that really encouraged me. So it sort of grew from there, and then I had the opportunity I failed my 11 plus, but at 13 we were allowed to take the exam again, which I passed, and I chose to go to this Northwest Ham County Tech, which was an art and commerce school. So obviously I didn't do the commerce, and I was lucky enough that our form teacher, I don't know if he was a successful commercial artist, but he had been out in the industry, so he knew what he was talking about. And, we just grew from there. You
won a competition when you were 13, didn't you?
Yeah, I came second place.
Oh, second place.
It was some nationwide thing.
Yeah.
But the guy who came first from our school actually went with me for the interview at Link Studio because we both chose to go to the art and commerce school, and he was obviously he was but he was interested in the advertising side, whereas I was for the illustration side, the figure work, and we got an interview in this studio, Link Studios. And of course, them being sort of comic strip, I was offered the position at the princely sum of £2, 5 shillings a week.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your life at that point, because I mean, you're born in 1938, so you're growing up during and after the Second World War. Opportunities of jobs for young lads were fairly limited. I mean, how did this kind of fit into your family's plans? I mean, what did your father do for a living?
He was a sailmaker and rigger.
Oh, right.
Believe it or not, living in the East End of London.
Right.
And one of my brothers went into his sort of the sailmaking job, and my other brother was in the forces, and my brother, who sort of showed me a lot as far as drawing goes, I think he went into the power station line, but I didn't really have much to do with them because I was the baby of the family.
Mm.
And they were all grown up and, well, living abroad, away from home.
Right. And I mean, as any student of history knows, the East End took paid a terrible toll in the Second World War. What was life for you as a kid like? I mean, were you? I'm making a judgment on based on what you said your dad did for a living, but I'm guessing there wasn't a lot of money in the family.
Oh no! I was the only one really that was allowed to do what I wanted to do as far as education goes, and this was, because my father had a full-time job, and so the opportunity came that I could go on to this school and then into my trade, whereas my other brothers were most probably forced to go into whatever they could get because they couldn't afford to go on to grammar school and places like that.
What was life like at the college that you went to, the art and commercial college?
Well, I mean, I can't compare it to any other school because I didn't go to any other school apart from a secondary modern before I took the exam. But we started off normal lessons. Okay, we may have had 1 or 2 art lessons extra a week. Then it went to a third of all the lessons, and then nearly 2/3 of the lessons. So by the time I was 16, you were doing it quite a lot, and gearing up to take the O-levels, and then go on to work.
Because this is the kind of education that I guess you wouldn't see much these days. It sounds like a very intense artistic education. Where was it all about sort of covering all the bases, things like anatomy and things like that, or
no, not to that degree.
Right.
I mean, don't forget we were only sort of between 13 and 16.
Sure.
And you weren't. I mean, though I say we were doing all these lessons, you covered advertising and illustration and stuff like that, but we didn't go into depth sort of anatomy. And though we did, he did try to drum in perspective, which was took a lot of drumming.
So it was much more a kind of a vocational thing, preparing you for the workplace.
Yeah, and as I pointed out before, he had been in the business, albeit maybe not successful, I don't know. But he prepared me, at least in that sense, what to expect. I mean, I always remember he said, the first thing you'll do is spend all day running around making tea. And I thought, well, God, that's not work. But that's how it was.
Yeah,
you were a tea boy to start with, then you went on to being sort of a messenger, and then you started to progress from there.
And in terms of the kind of thing that you were creating, your own art, does your style now kind of owe itself to what you were doing then, or was it very different? What kind of things were you doing?
We had no style to start with.
Yeah.
All you wanted, or one wanted to do, was to learn how to do things properly.
Yeah.
And by then, of course, I'd been offered this apprenticeship with this studio, which you don't get now. So I spent the next sort of 3 to 4 years slowly learning the trade, being taught by professionals, because it was an agency.
Yeah.
And so they had sort of working artists who paid a commission, obviously. So she was the agent. She got I'm talking about Doris White, who ran the studio. She was the agent who went out to get their work, but they worked in her studio, and she gave them, for the 25% she charged, which is quite little nowadays, compared with nowadays, she provided all the board, ink, reference, desk space, the lot. And of course, I was, being a boy there, I was assigned to one artist, though you had sort of 4 or 5 in the studio that you could ask, watch, and learn from.
And these guys, these artists who you were watching, Was it this was all commercial art they were doing?
They were all working for, which was Fleetway, but before then it was called Tallis House.
Right.
That was down just off the embankment. Then it became Fleetway, and then Fleetway was taken over by the people who I believe started 2000. Oh, I can't remember the names of the people now who took over.
Egmont?
That's right, yeah. They bought it out. They bought Fleetway and a lot of their art work. But all our artists in the studio when I was a lad all worked for Fleetway and Tallis House, which was School Friend, Girls Crystal, Eagle. Eagle and Girl were at Holton's, but you had these artists that were really top of what they were doing, and I had the privileged position of being able, because I worked the sort of reference library, that was part of our job, to stand, watch them, and we were assigned to one artist who, whenever I was called upon to do a drawing, which wasn't a lot then, but they would criticise it and tear it apart. But the good thing I've always thought is that having done that, they'd show you how you should have done it. For a silly thing like drawing a shoe, you would do your drawing, and they'd ridicule it, but they would then show you the correct way to draw that shoe. So it stuck. So
it was, very much an apprenticeship in the old style, where it's not just being a dog's body; it's actually being shown how to do the job.
You were shown. Okay, you were a dog's body in the sense that you did a lot of running around. You delivered artwork, etc., etc. Yeah. But that way, you got to see the editorial side and meet people there. So it was a no-brainer. You couldn't lose.
Well, what do you think was the most important thing that you learned doing that apprenticeship? I mean, obviously you've picked up many different styles. You've got lots of different criticism from different artists and things like that. What was the one thing that was the most important that you picked up?
Not to be too precious with your artwork.
Okay.
I mean, quite often I'd have been there about 2 years, and I was given somebody's artwork and told to strip it off the board and remount it on something else. Somebody may say, oh, you do this, you do that, and then they left it to you. So, you could easily have mucked it up. But once you start producing the artwork properly, you weren't too worried about what they did to it. So I've had work that's been completely chopped about and rejigged from a double spread down to 2 single pages. When I worked for Wham in Boys World, you couldn't throw a fit and create Merry Hell. You just delivered it and forgot about it. And, that as long as you were paid.
Well, it was one of the things I wanted to ask, as a young lad, not earning an awful lot. It wasn't until about 19 that you actually became a full-time artist, I believe.
Well, I was an apprentice, but I would just get paid a pittance, if I did anything extra, if I helped somebody. But then I started to get work in my own right. Not a lot. I mean, usually just these heading drawings, illustrations and things like that. But they would I'd get the 25% and they'd keep the other. But I was still collecting my wage. And I think officially I was still an apprentice.
Yeah.
So I couldn't complain. But mind you, the weekly wage never got above £5.
Right.
When I started, I remember saying to my mother, don't forget, £20-25 a week was an awful lot of money. That was a livable wage then in the 50s. And I said to her, you can have half of everything I earn up to a tenner.
Right.
So £2.50, half of that.
Yeah.
Didn't leave a lot, and I was having to go back to her and say, may I have some money for my fare into work, please? So it didn't really work. But then if you did have a really good week, and you brought back a lot of money, and I'm talking about a lot by those standards, my father couldn't believe it, but his mother cashed in on that.
What was your parents' attitudes towards your chosen career?
I think basically they were proud that I was doing it, but you see, they could all draw. Apart from my mother, all the men in the family could draw, and so it wasn't such a shock to them. And I think they were just pleased that I was able to earn a living from it. Because back then, I mean, all the parents seemed to be interested, especially in the working class at East End, was for you to earn enough to get your own place when you got married.
Yeah. You did 3 years in the RAF, which I presume was your national service.
No, it was a regular, actually.
Was it regular? Oh, right, interesting.
Well, I signed on for the extra year to get into a drawing office.
Ah, right, okay.
And so I joined a thing called JAREC, which is Joint Air Reconnaissance and Intelligence Centre.
Yeah.
So, which one of the requisites was a commercial art background.
Yeah.
And I spent nearly most of the 3 years in Singapore.
Oh, right, okay. And what was your job?
When they fly, I don't know if I'm breaking any secrets here, but when they fly and take photographs of areas to find out what it's like, to make maps for argument's sake, well, we plotted those photographs onto existing maps so that if you had to find detail of that specific area, you were given that code and you could go to the library and draw aerial photographs of that particular place. Whereas instead of just looking at a map, you actually got real life photographs of it. And it was used in air research, map making, all sorts of things.
Right, okay.
And I was a tracer, and my job was to annotate all the targets or the areas on that photograph so that someone could pick it up and read it in sequence. Right,
okay.
So I suppose a bit like working out frames on a page.
Yeah, well, that's exactly the idea that I was just came to mind. That's fascinating. I mean, was it interesting work or was it monotonous?
Well, I spent most of my time doing sort of adverts and posters for various concerns.
Right.
The CO his wife was very interested in art, and his daughter was a member of the theatre club where I was a member. And anything that needed doing, he'd come in and ask me. So if his wife wanted something, or the officers' mess wanted something, an advertising something, poster or other, and the theatre club wanted posters, etc. And I was allowed, when I wasn't doing annotation work, to do these in so-called firm's time.
Right.
So my drawing board in the office was covered in a clean sheet of card every morning. And if there were no photographs to put on top of it, I invariably had a poster or something I could work out. So, this is why I signed on for the extra year. I didn't want to be a policeman or a cook.
Yeah. That's not too bad, sort of, doing your service to the nation, but on your terms.
Oh, more or less. And when I came home, I had my brother was dying, and as I only had a short time to go, I was brought back to see him before he died. And so I was stationed at a place called in Huntingdon, Brampton the place was, and I could get up to London. And so on my Wednesday afternoon and weekends, I went back to Link Studio and I was running a job for Junior Express.
Right, okay. And at
the same time.
So as your service was winding down, you were actually setting yourself up for being demobbed.
Yeah, because I went back to the studio obviously, and I stayed there for quite a while until I thought, well, I want to do... Basically, everyone wanted to do a newspaper strip because obviously it paid more money. And I was in the office once at Eagle, actually, and a guy working for an agent called Les Lilly. He came in and we got chatting, and he obviously he was a writer as well, a script writer. So we both decided to offer something up to a newspaper. And of course, at this time, I decided to leave the studio. And luckily, we landed a job on one of the papers. That was Daily Sketch, I think it was, called The Seekers. But prior to that, of course, through his agency, I'd been working on, I just remembered, the Sunday Citizen, doing a weekly strip there.
Sure.
Sunday strip, and doing illustrations for them.
Because you while you were at Link, you'd been doing stuff for DC Thompson's girls publications and things like Champion the Wonder Horse.
Yeah, I came back.
Yeah.
And Link got me those jobs. I did most of it, well, not most, I did quite a few of the classics, like Great Expectations and Wuthering Heights, etc., etc. So I quickly realised that historical stuff was good in the sense that, A, it was interesting to look at when nothing was happening to the script, and B, it didn't date you. Because I've seen various artists come to the studio, and they, elderly ones, I suppose, as old as I am now, and they couldn't get the hang of the modern illustration, the then modern illustration. They were still living in the 30s and 40s, and the art editors were wanting stuff, right up to date in the late 50s, 60s. But you give these artists a historical thing to do, and they knock your socks off.
You were working in a time when, particularly when you were at Link, there's no bylines on this stuff. It just kind of appears.
No, they took them off.
Yeah.
If you dared sign it.
I mean, how did you feel about that? Was there a sense of injustice?
As I was saying earlier on, you learn not to be too precious about your work.
Sure. And
you hoped that people would know who it was anyway.
Yeah.
Because by then you were developing a little bit of style.
As one of the artists now working at the Link studio, did you have your own apprentice like you had been before?
Yeah.
Right.
I joined, and I was a boy to some guy who had actually been to the same school as me.
Right.
He'd gone there 2 years earlier, because every 2 years they got a new boy in.
Right.
And I was his apprentice, more or less. He looked after me.
Yeah.
But he left. I think he became a conscientious objector, and also that caused all sorts of problems. So I was under a guy called Harry Linfield, was a well-known, he worked on Girl, and then he went into advertising eventually. But the boy beneath me was a fellow called Barry Mitchell.
Right.
He was my boy, and I helped teach him, well, what little I knew at the time. But it's funny because later on, when I got a job on Countdown, the title strip, which was a colour page and one colour inside, the other two artists that were doing the colour pages, the centre spread was drawn by Harry Linfield from Link, and the back page colour was a guy called Jerry Haylock, who had been, or Harry Linfield had been his boy at Link.
Right.
And all three of us finished up doing what was quite a good top quality mag.
Okay, so almost like a kind of, I don't know, production line of people coming through and moving on and helping the next lad along.
Yeah, it was the only way you could work it, really. I mean, they had this policy when I joined of giving the sort of a chance to the sort of so-called working class lad who showed promise. Whereas a lot of them were very sort of, well, definitely not. They wouldn't have known how to cope in the streets I was brought up in. So it was a good idea. I mean, eventually, I think after Barry, there was a young lad joined not long after he did. But then it all sort of petered out in that respect because you can't live on what they were paying.
And I guess the job market, the way that the economy was changing, meant that this kind of studio system. I mean, I remember talking to Ron Smith and John Cooper and a couple of other guys about their experience of studios and how over time it just didn't become economical anymore for the artists to be working like that.
No, I mean, I often thought it would be nice to do something like that. But then you think, well, the boy wants, if you take a boy on, he still wants a livable wage.
Yeah.
And you just cannot do the work that brings in that sort of money and run a studio.
Yeah.
I mean, we've turned down people, out of art school when I was in the studio, simply because we knew that they just wouldn't be able to cope on the sort of money we were offering. One of them might have a family. You couldn't exist on what we were prepared to pay because though you'd been to art school, you still had to learn how to do it properly. It's terrible to say that, but I'm sure you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting that you've had such a prolific career. Various, so many different titles, and then you've got somebody like Barry Mitchell who has gone on to things. Went on to things like Pow Wham and Smash and Scorcher and even Action and Roy the Rovers. This clearly. This way of teaching people clearly gave you a good foundation for strong careers.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of those were sort of sports and car type strips he was doing.
Yeah,
because that was his interest. I could do them if I had to, but I was basically just the adventure strip, and the newspaper gave me that because by then I had sort of moved on to the newspaper strip, which is a whole new genre.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Seekers, which was about a team who found missing people. I mean, that ran for 5 years. What was the kind of schedule like for you? How quickly were you putting these out?
Well, you had to do a set at 6 days worth of strip a week, which then, if you were to look at my CV, I think I was doing 2 other jobs. I haven't got it in front of me, so I couldn't tell you. But it wasn't just that. I suppose it was because if you were offered a job, you very rarely said no, simply because, you turn me down, I won't offer you it again. And you had to think like that.
Yeah.
I don't know if it works now. I suppose it works the same now.
I think it pretty much does. I mean, it's the freelancer's dilemma, isn't it? If I turn this down, then there might not be work in the future.
Yeah, and then once you've said yes, you have to think, hell, how am I going to fit that in my sort of half a dozen other jobs? So it's you worked long hours. You say, it must be good, working for yourself.
Yeah.
But you have deadlines. I mean, and you can't afford to be poorly because newspaper strips started off you were about 6 weeks in advance. Well, that could soon wither away if there's something happened,
Yeah.
And suddenly, you've got a week in hand. You're going balmy, and the newspaper's going silly, because if you miss a slot, you never get it back.
Yeah.
And they quite often sort of fold the strip. So, you were quite pushed in these deadlines. So it got so you worked out your routine, your schedules, and hopefully you didn't catch a cold, or you didn't injure yourself or cut yourself.
Yeah. I guess that's the kind of commercial reality. To a certain extent, it's slightly softened these days for some artists, because comic books can be held back or postponed. But back then, as you say, if you didn't deliver the goods, that was it.
It's now on 2000, you do get a lot of leeway. Whereas when I was first started, you had to produce these 2, 3. Whatever number of pages or strips you were doing every week.
Yeah.
You had to get it finished. There's no sort of, I know, I'll leave that and do twice as much next week. It doesn't work like that. Or it didn't work like that.
One thing I want to ask you about, I saw a comment, you did an interview for the magazine a number of years ago, where you said you still think of yourself as a black and white artist. And I guess on things like, The Seekers and Modesty Blaze and the other newspaper strips that you've done, that was very much your kind of pen and ink black and white style. I was going to ask whether it was because you find that easiest, or is it the most adaptable? What's your favourite thing about working in black and white?
I think I was trained to do black and white. Colour just crept up on me. I find it quite difficult now just to do black and white. But back then, it was I was comfortable with it, and I knew what I was doing, well, most of the time. And as I say, having been trained on newspaper strips, of course, I did colour strips before the newspaper strips, but I don't know, I just enjoyed it better, I think, then. And to be honest, I still do. I mean, if you look at some of my artwork now, quite often I'll do a pen drawing underneath with very little colour on it. It just, if the subject and the situation calls for it, I think sometimes it works better than colour as such.
Well, there's with black and white, there's an amount of draftsmanship that has to be done, because the colour is, the colour isn't going to do the work for you, so you have to put it down on the page. Yeah,
I suppose you're working to your own standard in that respect, and I felt I had the confidence of youth and thought I was wonderful. So you never had any worries about that.
Just on the point of the use of colour, I mean, you were working on Countdown.
Yeah.
And there's a wonderful quote that I read of yours saying, we just bought ourselves a colour television.
Yeah.
Quite often the shadows on faces and clothing were never pure black. They had some colour in them. I started using that on my art. And it got more extreme over time. And one of the things I wanted to ask about, since we're talking about black and white versus colour, is how your use of colour and your use of contrasting colour and colour as for shadow has become more bold over the years. When you're talking about Dredd strips like the...
but don't forget, though, that when I sort of discovered this, it was already being done by Italian artists.
Right.
They were streaks ahead of us,
right,
as far as colour and drawing went. And so I had a stint on the romance magazines.
Yes. And
had the opportunity of seeing all their artwork. And some of it was unbelievable. And you'd think, oh, God. And you could always tell an English artist. There was no flair, no nothing. I don't know if it was the sun or what, or the women or whatever, but there was a marked difference, and we didn't seem to have it.
When you say that you were inspired by this, was this partly to just kind of compete, or was?
Well, yes. I mean, you tried they were getting all the work. So we thought, well, heck, we've got to try and do something. Let's try and get some of the work. But, way back before I went into the forces in 58, there was Junior Express had just started and on Fleet Street. And they had an Italian artist, I believe he was Italian, and they were doing a sort of life of Christ, etc.
Yeah.
And his use of flat colour was unbelievable. But of course he had all the drawing underneath. And, I've always said that, I don't know if I can get it right, good colour won't save bad drawing, but good drawing will carry any sort of colour, bad or good. And I've proved that to myself quite often.
I mean, it's interesting that this style, this use of colour, always having that foundation of the line work there, has continued throughout your career. So it's become your style. It's still the recognisable John Byrne style.
It's quicker.
It's quicker.
There are deadlines control what you're doing in that respect. I mean, I can remember working really close, and because I worked at home, I'd shout out to my wife, Julie, think of a colour. And if I could fit that in, I would. She wouldn't know what I was shouting out for, but quite often it worked, or you've got to, and it's watching that TV thing and then taking it to its extreme. I suppose I developed that style that I used on Countdown. I've refined it since, but I still drop back into it occasionally.
Yeah, I mean, it's noticeable on things like tripods and the colour stuff you're doing for Countdown and various other strips at the time. It's kind of the thread that binds it all together. You however far you push it, it's always coming back to that same. Well, as you say, the bit you find easiest.
Well, as I say, it's quicker. I suppose, yes, you have to think about it, but you don't have to think too much because, as I say, if you've got the drawing underneath, and you make a fluff up of the colour, it's not that important. But if you've got awful drawing, it sticks out a mile. If you put bad colour on top of it. And so that was always my maxim, try to get the drawing. Well, I was taught actually right from the word go, learn how to draw as best as you can, and the other will come easy. It didn't come easy, but it did come.
One thing I wanted to ask you about is going back to the newspaper strips. I mean, we've mentioned the Seekers, but you also worked. You pitched with Conrad Frost, who's the writer, George and Lynn, the strip that ran in the Sun. I mean, that began in 1976. That's got quite a cult following. Tell us a bit more about how George and Lynn came to be, because for those listeners who've never seen it, it's just a tale of an ordinary day. But with partial nudity.
Yeah, it was a bit naughty sometimes, but I was finishing a job for Sunday Times colour supplement, and I just delivered the artwork, and Conrad was in the office at the same time. I think he was doing something for them or trying to sell something to them. And we got talking. And he wondered if being a scriptwriter, thought, well, there's an opportunity. We've got the artist here. Perhaps we could get together. So we went round to the pub and talked about it. And we came up with one character, but it didn't really go. And so he said, well, I've got this other story of a couple who move to one of the islands in the on the Thames, because I didn't know at the time, but he lived there. And I said, "Oh, that sounds interesting." So he said, "Well, I'll send you a script." And he sent me a couple of scripts, and I did the artwork. I think I did the lettering. I'm not quite sure at the same time. And we showed it, and it was shown to the Sun. And they said, "Yes, please." And suddenly we got a daily, just like that.
Sure.
And that's how it went. I think I met him twice I don't know how many years I worked on it. Well, that first time, and I think twice from then, and I think it was about 6 or 7 years we worked, he would just send the script and I would just send in the artwork. And that was it. No need to talk or confer or anything like that. Nowadays, the writer wants to live in your pocket, which is very disconcerting. I mean, I know it may do for benefit the strip, but it's a pain.
So you just like to get the script, get on with it.
Yeah. Though I must admit, one of my favourite writers I did socialise with was Angus Allen on Looking, but he was a nice character as well. So not inferring that writers are not nice, but
some of them are a bit dodgy, to be fair. Yeah.
Well, I try not to find out.
I mean, it's interesting.
I must be terrible to work for because they get no feedback.
But all this beautiful artwork comes back, so I guess they have that.
Yeah, well, depending how you look at it, but yes, it's I've been brought up that you're given a script, and you wouldn't be given it if you couldn't do it.
Yeah.
So get along, do it, and wait for the next script. If somebody wants to say, "Oh, that was nice," that's great. If not, well, if it appears in the paper or the magazine, then your job is complete. You're never taught to make a fuss about it, and I was always taught that the artwork should speak for you. I know all these maxims are awful, isn't it? I live by them.
Well, I'm going to jump forward a little bit because you'd worked with, without knowing it, John Wagner and Alan Grant on the relaunched Eagle in '83, doing the Fists of Danny Pike, which is not only an amazing title but a very interesting strip. And it wasn't until 1991 that you actually started working for 2000 AD. How did that come about?
Can't remember.
Oh.
So, I'm sorry, but I've been working in this business for 60 years or more. And I can't remember. I think I got a feeling it was Nikolai Dante I did, the first one. I'm not sure.
It was Judge Dredd, the very first one.
Oh, was it? No,
yeah.
That's probably why I feel like I do about it.
Well, I wanted to come on to Judge Dredd because you've not been particularly sort of kind in your opinions about the character. He's
a great character, it's a great storyline, great everything, but a devil to draw because A, you can't see his face, not that that's a problem, but what he wears, if you stick to the original drawing, he shouldn't be able to move. And I suppose basically I'm a sort of in the tradition of the American newspaper strips of Kirby and Alex Raymond and Stan Drake. I'm a sort of photorealistic type artist.
Sure.
And so exaggerating everything has to be done on, I have to go out of my way to do it. It doesn't come naturally. Whereas drawing as lifelike as I can is easier. And that sounds silly to say that, but that's the way it is.
Well, no, I think you're onto something there because I've often thought of your artwork in the same context as Ron Smith's, where I think a lot of people who are reading Ron Smith's work in the 1980s weren't all that keen on it because although he had these ridiculous elements in it, so he did Otto Sump and Abelard Snaz and all these silly characters. Everything was over the top. His cityscapes were very practical. So the skyscrapers looked like modern skyscrapers. The industrial landscape looked like you'd see in any industrial city. And that's the one thing that I've always found fascinating about your depictions of Judge Dredd's world is that there is that kind of attempt to marry what you know and can see and have done before with these weird science fiction elements. It's an interesting kind of conflict dynamic going on in your artwork between what you like to draw and what the script is asking you to draw.
Yeah, it's I suppose basically because I don't have the imagination for this sort of futuristic stuff. Well, I get by, but I like the stories that are based on people. And this is a throwback to my daily strip thing. I'm happier when we get these situations where people are talking to each other and you need to show how they're feeling, etc., by the way they move, they sit, everything about them. Whereas when you've got them in spacesuits, etc., it's so boring. I'm afraid I tend to lose interest.
One strip that I remember quite fondly, and I think was actually name-checked by Carl Urban, who played Dredd in the most recent movie as one of his favourites, was Raider, that was, I think, was written by Garth Ennis. And I still very vividly remember, because Raider had the two sort of automatic pistols with the infrared sights on them. And I presume you'd cut out a stencil for them going on, but you'd either use paint or some pastels or something, and kind of very bright red, kind of just gone back and forth over the top. And I remember poring over it as a teenager, just amazed that this was comic book artwork, because so much of accepted wisdom on comics is that they're a reductive art form, but here you were doing really nice and inventive stuff. Despite the kind of struggle between the kind of stuff that you wanted to draw and the stuff you were being asked to do, you still seem to put an awful lot of work into those pages.
Well, that's what you get paid for, isn't it? You've got to make it interesting.
Yeah.
If only for yourself. And so you create these situations, or you do bits and pieces. You do get carried away sometimes. But I don't consciously think like this. I don't. I just do what it calls for at the time, and I may embellish it occasionally, but sort of go over the top sometimes. But I don't. I know it sounds awful. I don't think a lot about it. I do it.
Yeah.
I make a lousy teacher because I couldn't teach anyone to draw really well if they A, weren't interested, and B, sort of could draw to start with, because I haven't got the patience in that respect. And I suppose it works the same for me. And if it's something that if there's one little element in there that I can grab hold of to make it interesting, then I will.
Yeah.
It may have nothing to do with the story. But if it makes it look real.
Yeah.
So that's basically, I suppose what I'm trying to do is make the situations and the people within them not cartoon characters, but as real to real life as possible within the strip. And sometimes that calls for a little bit of extra work to get it over.
I mean, I find that fascinating because I've spoken to other artists, even somebody like Jock, who says, the more he thinks about something, the more likely he is to be unhappy with the result. Whereas if he just, starts doing it starts getting it down on the page, then it's much more intuitive.
It's like going back to that sort of, you do 10 layouts for a job, and it's invariably the first one you thought of that you choose. And it's the same with the strip thing. You just go, this is why it was better way back when you had these tight deadlines. I mean, sometimes I do a batch and I go back to the beginning and I think, oh, God, that was awful drawing. And so I'd redraw it. Whereas if I'd have stuck with it in the first place and carried it through to the final part, it wouldn't be as bad as I thought it was, and I wouldn't have to have redrawn it. And the job most probably would have got done quicker as well. I'm sorry, I always seem to go back to speed, and it's this pressure of getting things done on time. It's instilled in you, and I hate it.
Well, I guess to a certain extent that's a product of the way that you were taught, really. You know, that time was money.
Well, it still is, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Where are you living?
All right, time is money. Time is money. One thing I wanted to move on to was Nikolai Dante.
Yeah.
Because you're not a particular fan of sci-fi, and you know, we've talked a little bit about Judge Dredd, but with Dante, it just seems to be a very happy marrying of the kind of adventure stories that you enjoyed doing earlier in your career with a little bit of science fiction as well. So you know, you've got some heavy historical elements, coming back to the point you made about, you know, if the story is not interesting, at least you've got something pretty to look at. It seems to be a happy accident that you ended up on a strip that had all those elements in it.
Well, I looked at it and I followed it, and I thought, now, that as a strip is sort of more me. And in fact, I think I asked Andy if I could do one. And that's how it all started.
Right.
And of course, the lovely thing is that we set most of the uniforms they wore after Simon had sort of set the scenes, you know, the type of way Dante was looking. We embellished it by going to sort of full Napoleonic type style of clothing.
Yeah.
Simply, as I was saying earlier on, so that even when nothing was happening, you had something to look at. And I wouldn't have to draw these space things. But no, seriously though, it made it feel, and of course better for me. Here again, you see, it's trying to do something that I enjoy doing. So it works. So the job works, and it's slightly humorous, though some of the stuff I had to draw, you know, all the humour had gone in that respect. It was rather sort of gruesome in places. But normally, when we got onto the light-hearted stuff, I had great fun because we had the action drawing then. And I always felt quite at home doing that sort of stuff.
Well, the stuff like the Star Wars stories. There's some real drama in there, some really heavy stuff.
Oh yeah, it's the same with Nikolai. There was a sort of the angst side of him, and when people died that he loved, etc. So you were called upon, and this was again my background in newspaper strips. It invariably boiled down to a 1-to-1 in the strip. And that never fazed me at all in that respect. I was quite at home doing that sort of stuff.
It's a strip that certainly seemed to play to your strengths, not just the stuff you enjoy doing, but the stuff that, you know, really stands out from your career. The strip really plays to your strengths.
Yeah, whether that was on purpose by the scriptwriter, I don't know. I mean, I got on quite well with Robbie, and I think he put things in that he knew I would enjoy drawing.
I kind of there's so much I want to talk to you about. There's the Bendati Vendetta and there's the old UFO story, and we've not got enough time really. But one thing, the reason I wanted to chat to you is because we've got the collected edition of The Order. Which is coming out next month, and I mean, talking about strips that appeal to your strengths. I mean, this has got everything. You know, it's got Teutonic knights and Elizabethan car chases and all sorts. Was this a strip that Matt Smith, our editor, brought to you to do, or had you been involved earlier in the process?
No, I thought of an idea for a strip for one publication, and I got Keck to do some scripts, but it wasn't. I don't think it was working in that respect. So I said, "Well, let's try 2000," and he went away and came up with this idea. And sort of we put it to Matt, and he accepted it.
What did you think of Keck's idea when he brought it to you?
Well, he's like all writers, isn't he? You know, they think they're writing for the movies instead of single action frames.
Sure.
But you just have to adapt to whichever writer you get. But I enjoyed his stuff. He had quite a good imagination. If only I could break him of this habit of putting sort of full-scale wars in, a 3x4 drawing.
Well, and you've got these absolutely massive worms running around and various incarnations of the same robot and things.
I don't mind. My wife hates them, but there you go.
And it's, I mean, in a relatively short space of time, that series has brought together enough for a trade paperback, and I kind of wanted to as we bring our chat to a close, I kind of wanted to talk about your work rate, because you're still putting out the pages. They're still at an incredible
No, I'm slowing
level.
down.
It's slowing down?
Slowing down.
Right,
yeah.
okay.
Well, it's bound to happen, but
it's not a bad run to start slowing down after, to be honest with you at this point.
Well, you try to make 80, but there you go. Don't tell the wife.
How many pages do you put out a week?
Oh, I don't now, in
Really?
that respect.
Right.
No, I do odd commissions and things like that, but that's most probably gets me behind in certain things.
Sure.
But we won't say any more about that. No, it didn't help Matt bringing it down to 3 weeks for 6 pages. I know it sounds a long time, and if I were 20 years younger, I would say, "Oh, that's easy." But now it's because of this, I get involved in the thing, and so I put far too much work in.
Right.
But I can't help it. It's just the way I am.
I mean, that's remarkable. You're still in a position to be able to do that. You're.
I hope so.
Well, a strip like The Order, which I've found absolutely fantastic. There doesn't. You may have slowed down, but as far as I'm concerned, without hyperbole and not wishing to speak out of turn, I haven't seen any drop off in quality.
Keep saying that. Keep on that.
But it's remarkable that your style is still there. You're still putting out the pages.
Because I'm drawing stuff that doesn't date.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas I suppose if I was to do a romance strip now with all the modern young ladies, I could do it, but it would be such a headache. Because it's not, when I was drawing young ladies, you had Janet Rager and stuff like that. Well, I knew all that on sort of underwear because of the various strips I was doing, so it was no hassle. But now, well, I don't know. As I say, I'm getting old and slowing down. Not that old, though.
If there was something that somebody came to you and said, we will revive any strip from your career that you wanted.
If I could draw it as I was drawing it then,
yeah,
to the same quality, it would be the German strip I did for Bill.
Right.
Or Lily.
Yeah.
It's the only strip I've had that they changed the name of the main character after about a month. But no, I was given, same as George and Lynn, really, in the sense that they faxed me the strips, or the joke a day, and they had a lovely turn of phrase translation into English. And they'd send me about 20 of these ideas, and I'd just pick 6 in order and do them. That was it. I didn't have no one jumped down my neck or anything like that. I was allowed to do. That's when I enjoyed black and white most, because I could use it as I felt it should be used.
Looking back on, I mean, you've been working for 2000 AD since 1991.
That long?
Yeah. So much of so many of the publications that you worked on and you know have gone, and the industry has so fundamentally changed. What has it meant to you beyond just, you know, the paycheck, that 2000 AD is still there and there's still this audience for your work?
Well, you say that, but I don't only go to the Bristol convention. And I don't see a great queue at my desk, but then again, I don't draw the space stuff, do I? So mainly I get other artists or old chaps like me.
Well, it's certainly, having spoken to Sean Phillips and various other artists, you know, there is a huge appreciation of your work as an influence on them over over the years. So, you know, it's not been in vain. I don't think. I think probably your influence is probably greater than you realise.
Well, I've always wanted or tried to be the sort of artist. That may sound tough on the guys who buy the comics, etc. But I liken it sort of like Tony Bennett, the singer. Everyone, all the other artists, singers, thought he was wonderful. And that's how I would like to be thought of. I mean, it's nice to know that the person in the street likes the artwork, but I'm not sure whether they fully appreciate everything that you put into it. Whereas if you're drawing for your peers in that respect and they appreciate it, it's quite good.
What a pleasure. What an absolute pleasure to talk to John. Fascinating insight into his life and works. And make sure you do pick up a copy of The Order, which is available from all good bookshops and comic book shops and our web shop and apps next month. Make sure that you celebrate 40 years of the galaxy's greatest comic with us, Earthlets. It's been a pleasure being able to share just a little bit of it over the last couple of years with the Thrillcast, but there's so much more we have to discover together. Do make sure you pick up a copy of our 40th anniversary special. Stick with 2000 AD and the Thrillcast as we continue to bring you the greatest stories from the galaxy. Here's to another 40 years. Splundig Verthvig, Earthlets.
Alert! Alert! Thrill power levels dangerously high. Alert! Read 2000 AD every week. Ask your comic book store or newsagent now. Subscribe to the galaxy's greatest comic at 2000adonline.com. Subscribe digitally on our apps for Apple, Android, and Windows 10. And download DRM free copies from 2000adonline.com. Alert! Stand by for urgent updates. Search for 2000AD on Twitter and Facebook. Watch the latest videos at youtube.com/ 2000AD online and follow on Instagram at Insta2000AD. Program complete. Shutting down.